The stars had always seemed peaceful to Dr. Elena Vasquez as she worked late nights at the observatory. She never imagined that somewhere among those distant lights, an empire stretched across 12 galaxies, ruling over hundreds of worlds with an iron fist wrapped in psychic energy. The Zephyrian Empire had existed for over 50,000 years, built on a simple principle that had never failed them. Power came from the mind, and minds came in ranks. At the very top floated the Zephyrians themselves, beings of pure mental energy who could reshape reality with a thought. Below them came the telepaths, species blessed with the gift of mind reading and mental communication across vast distances. Further down were those with limited psychic abilities, useful for basic tasks but nothing more. And at the very bottom, despised and barely worth noticing, were the silent ones. These were species so mentally weak that they could not even sense the psychic energies that flowed through the universe like invisible rivers. The Empire had a use for silent ones, of course. Every civilization needed workers, and beings too stupid to resist mentally made excellent slaves. For 50,000 years, this system had worked perfectly. The Empire expanded steadily, finding new worlds and new species to slot into their hierarchy. Some species tried to fight, but psychic powers always won against crude physical weapons. Others tried to hide, but telepathic searches always found them. Most simply surrendered when they saw the Empire's might, accepting their place in the great cosmic order. Elena knew none of this as she adjusted her telescope on that Tuesday evening in March. She was tracking unusual energy, readings that had appeared near Jupiter 3 days ago. The readings made no sense according to any physics she knew, but the data was clear. Something was out there, and it was big. She was still puzzling over the numbers when the sky above Earth changed. It started as a shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Then the shimmer spread, covering the entire visible sky in rippling distortions. Elena grabbed her camera, hands shaking as she tried to document what she was seeing. The distortions grew stronger, and suddenly the night sky tore open like fabric. Through the tears came ships. They were beautiful in a way that hurt to look at, all flowing curves and surfaces that seemed to bend light around them. Some were small, no bigger than fighter jets. Others stretched for miles, their hulls glowing with soft energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. Elena counted dozens, then hundreds, then stopped counting as more kept emerging from the holes in space. The largest ship settled into orbit directly above North America. It was impossible to judge its true size from the ground, but it blocked out a significant portion of the star field. Smaller ships descended through Earth's atmosphere, moving with impossible grace. They showed no concern for air resistance or gravity, simply gliding down like falling leaves that had chosen their own path. Elena was not the only one watching. Around the world, every telescope, every satellite, every pair of eyes that could see the sky witnessed the arrival. Military bases went to high alert. Government leaders were rushed to bunkers. Scientists like Elena simply stared in wonder and terror at proof that humanity was no longer alone. The ships did not attack. They simply waited, hanging in the sky like a promise of change. 3 hours after the first ship appeared, every electronic device on Earth received the same message. Televisions interrupted their programs. Radios crackled to life. Even simple devices like digital clocks displayed the words in whatever language their viewer would understand. The message was short and absolute. Greetings, inhabitants of the third planet. You have been discovered by the Zephyrian Empire. Prepare for assessment and integration into imperial structure. Resistance will be noted and punished. Compliance will be rewarded with continued existence. You have 72 hours to prepare your leaders for contact. Elena read the message on her laptop screen and felt her stomach drop. The clinical tone made it clear this was not a first contact between equals. This was a notice of conquest. Around the world, reactions varied. Some nations immediately began preparing for war, moving military assets and calling up reserves. Others tried to establish communication with the alien ships, broadcasting messages of peace and welcome. A few simply waited, recognizing that their response would matter little against technology that could tear holes in space itself. Elena found herself thinking not about politics or military strategy, but about the physics involved. How did the ships move without visible propulsion? How had they opened those rifts in space? The energy requirements alone should have been enormous, yet the ships showed no signs of massive power sources. It was as if they were operating on principles that human science had never discovered. She spent the next 2 days glued to every piece of data she could find. Amateur astronomers around the world shared their observations. Military radar tracked the ship's movements. Physicists debated theories about how the alien technology might work. Elena absorbed it all, building a picture in her mind of capabilities that seemed to mock human understanding of the universe. The aliens were clearly using some form of exotic matter manipulation. Their ships defied gravity not through thrust but by altering the space around them. The rifts they had opened suggested mastery over dimensional physics that humans could barely theorize about. Most intriguing of all were the energy patterns Elena detected whenever the ships moved or communicated. The patterns looked almost organic, as if the technology was responding to something like thought, rather than mechanical control. On the third day, the aliens made contact. A single small ship descended to the lawn of the United Nations building in New York. It landed without sound, without visible exhaust, without disturbing so much as a blade of grass beneath it. A hatch opened that had not been visible moments before, and something emerged. Elena watched the live broadcast like billions of others around the world. The being that stepped from the ship was humanoid but clearly alien. It stood nearly 8 feet tall with elongated limbs and skin that shifted color like oil on water. Most unsettling were its eyes, which seemed to look not just at the cameras filming it, but through them, as if it could see the people watching on the other side. The being spoke, and its words appeared as text on screens, while its actual voice remained a musical humming that bypassed the ears entirely. Helena realized with growing alarm that it was speaking directly into human minds. "I am Assessor Kethvar of the Zephyrian Empire. Your species will now be evaluated for proper placement within Imperial hierarchy. Based on preliminary scans, you appear to be silent ones, incapable of psychic communication or energy manipulation. This places you in the lowest category of Imperial citizenship. Your planet contains resources useful to the Empire. Relocation of your population to appropriate work sites will begin within 1 standard period. Your leaders will now surrender authority to Imperial administration." Elena felt something cold settle in her chest as she realized what was happening. Humanity had just been classified, catalogued, and sentenced to slavery, all in the space of a few clinical sentences. The being called Kethvar was not here to negotiate or establish diplomatic relations. He was here to inform Earth of decisions that had already been made by powers humanity could not even imagine. But as Elena stared at the alien on her screen, one thought kept echoing in her mind. How did it work? How did the mind-speech function? How did their technology operate? What were the principles behind powers that seemed like magic? She did not know it yet, but that simple curiosity would soon reshape the galaxy. Assessor Kethvar had performed this duty 847 times across his career. The process was always the same. Arrive at a newly discovered world, demonstrate Imperial power, accept the inevitable surrender, and begin integration procedures. Silent ones made it even simpler, since they could not mount psychic resistance or attempt mental communication. They were purely physical beings, limited to crude spoken language and primitive gestures. Standing on the lawn of the United Nations building, Kethvar felt the familiar satisfaction of another successful classification. The beings of this world called Earth were textbook silent ones. His psychic scans detected no mental emanations beyond basic biological brain function. No telepathic abilities, no energy manipulation capabilities, no signs of higher consciousness development. They would make adequate workers once properly trained and relocated. The human leaders had gathered as instructed, though Kethvar noted their obvious anxiety with mild amusement. Some tried to project authority through their posture and clothing, but their primitive minds radiated fear and confusion in waves visible to his enhanced perception. A few attempted to speak, but their words were meaningless babble about sovereignty and international law, concepts that had no relevance under Imperial authority. Kethvar was preparing to conclude the assessment when one of the humans stepped forward. She was smaller than most of the others, with dark hair and intelligent eyes behind corrective lenses. Unlike the officials around her, she showed no signs of wanting to project authority. Instead, she simply looked at him with an expression he had rarely seen from silent ones during first contact. Curiosity. "Excuse me," the human said in clear, measured tones. "Before we proceed with whatever integration process you have planned, I have a request." Kethvar paused. Silent ones did not make requests during assessment. They pleaded, they surrendered, they occasionally tried to bargain with offers of resources or information, but requests implied a level of agency that silent ones simply did not possess. "Speak," he said, more from surprise than any obligation to listen. "My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez. I'm a physicist. What I want to know is this." She gestured toward his ship, toward him, toward the air itself. "How does it work?" The question hung in the air like an alien concept. Kethvar felt his mental processes stumble over the simple words. How does what work? Everything? Did this silent one think he would explain Imperial technology to a primitive mind that could not even grasp basic psychic principles? "Your request is irrelevant," he said finally. "Silent ones do not require understanding of Imperial methods. You require only compliance." But Elena Vasquez did not step back or lower her eyes as defeated silent ones typically did. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and continued as if he had not spoken. "The way your ship moves suggests gravitational field manipulation rather than conventional propulsion. The energy patterns I detected during your arrival indicate some form of exotic matter interaction, and the fact that you can speak directly into our minds implies either telepathic broadcasting or direct neural interface technology. I'm curious about the mechanisms involved." Kethvar stared at the human. In 847 assessments, no silent one had ever described Imperial technology with anything approaching accuracy. Most could barely comprehend what they were seeing, let alone analyze the principles behind it. Yet this primitive being had identified several key aspects of psychic engineering with remarkable precision. "You are silent ones," he said, though something in his voice suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "You possess no psychic abilities. You cannot understand Imperial science." "Maybe not," Elena agreed, "but I understand physics. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only converted. Matter and space can be bent, but only through the application of force. What you're doing follows rules. Even if they're rules we haven't discovered yet. I want to know what those rules are." Around Elena, the human leaders were beginning to look nervous. Some tried to interrupt, speaking in rapid bursts about diplomatic protocol and proper channels. But Kethvar found himself ignoring them entirely, focused on the small human who stood before him asking impossible questions. In his centuries of service to the Empire, Kethvar had never encountered a situation like this. Imperial protocol had procedures for resistance, for surrender, for attempted negotiation. But there was no protocol for a silent one who wanted to learn rather than submit. The very concept was contradictory. Silent ones submitted because they could not understand. If they could understand, they would not be silent ones. "Your curiosity is noted but irrelevant," Kethvar said, falling back on standard responses. "The assessment is complete. Your species will be relocated to appropriate work assignments within the Imperial structure. Individual requests cannot be accommodated." Elena nodded as if she had expected this response. "I understand you have your procedures, but consider this. If we're going to be part of your empire, wouldn't it be more efficient if we understood how to work with your technology rather than just following orders blindly? Informed workers are more productive workers." The logic was sound, which disturbed Kethvar more than he cared to admit. Silent ones were not supposed to present logical arguments. They were supposed to be logical arguments incapable of such reasoning. Yet here was one doing exactly that and doing it well. "Silent ones are incapable of comprehending Imperial science," he said, though his conviction was beginning to waver. "Have you tested that assumption?" Elena asked. "Have you ever actually tried to explain how your technology works to a species you classified as silent ones?" The question struck Kethvar like a physical blow. In all his centuries of service, in all the assessments he had performed, he had never considered the possibility. Silent ones were classified as silent because they showed no psychic abilities during initial contact. Once classified, they were processed according to established procedures. No one had ever thought to test whether they might be capable of learning what they could not naturally do. "The classification system has been in place for 50,000 years, Kethvar said weakly. "It has never failed." Elena smiled, and there was something unsettling about the expression. "Then this should be interesting," she said. "Because I think your classification system just encountered its first real test." Around them, the human leaders continued their nervous chatter, and Imperial ships hung motionless in the sky, waiting for orders that suddenly seemed less certain than they had moments before. Kethavar found himself facing a possibility that challenged everything he understood about the Empire's cosmic order. What if the Silent Ones were not silent by nature, but simply silent because no one had ever bothered to teach them how to speak? The thought was heretical. It was dangerous. It was also, Kethavar realized with growing alarm, potentially true. For the first time in his long career, Assessor Kethavar did not know what to do next. The small human woman stood before him, waiting patiently for an answer to her simple, devastating question. How does it work? The question that would change everything had been asked. Now someone would have to decide whether to answer it. Kethavar had made what he thought was a clever decision. Faced with an anomalous Silent One who claimed to want understanding, he would give her exactly what she asked for. He would demonstrate Imperial technology in all its glory, overwhelming her primitive mind with concepts far beyond her capability to grasp. When she inevitably failed to comprehend even the simplest psychic principles, he could complete his assessment with confidence and file an interesting footnote about unusually persistent Silent One behavior. The demonstration was set up in a cleared area behind the United Nations building. Kethavar had requested basic materials: water, metal, stone, and various electronic devices that the humans used for their crude technology. Elena Vasquez stood nearby with a small group of other humans she had identified as scientists. They carried primitive recording devices and what appeared to be measurement tools, though Kethavar doubted they would be of any use. "Observe," Kethavar said, extending one elongated hand toward a steel beam that had been placed on the ground. "This is basic matter manipulation through psychic energy projection." The steel began to glow with soft blue light. Slowly, it started to bend and twist, flowing like liquid while maintaining its solid properties. Kethavar shaped it into an intricate spiral pattern, then returned it to its original form, then transformed it into a perfect sphere. Throughout the process, he monitored Elena's vital signs and brain activity, expecting to see the glazed confusion that typically overcame Silent Ones when exposed to psychic phenomena. Instead, he detected intense focus and what appeared to be rapid analytical thinking. "Fascinating," Elena said, circling the steel sphere and examining it from multiple angles. "The molecular structure appears unchanged despite the physical reshaping. You're not heating the metal or altering its chemical bonds. You're manipulating space around the atoms themselves, aren't you?" Kethavar stopped mid-gesture, his concentration disrupted by surprise. That was not a question a Silent One should be capable of asking. "You cannot detect molecular structure," he said. "Silent Ones lack the sensory capabilities." "You're right, I can't detect it directly," Elena agreed, pulling out a handheld device. "But I can measure it. This is a portable spectrometer. It analyzes the electromagnetic signature of materials." She took readings of the steel sphere, frowning at the results. "That's interesting. The atomic structure is identical to the original beam, but there are residual energy patterns I don't recognize, almost like the space around each atom remembers being shaped differently." Elena looked up from her device, eyes bright with excitement. "You're not manipulating matter at all. You're manipulating space-time itself, aren't you? Bending the dimensional framework around objects to change their apparent physical properties, while leaving their fundamental nature unchanged." Kethavar felt something cold settle in his stomach. The human had reached a conclusion that took most Imperial Academy students years of study to understand. And she had done it in minutes using primitive measuring tools and pure deductive reasoning. "The process is more complex than your simple mind can grasp," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Then show me something more complex," Elena said immediately. "Please, I want to understand." Against his better judgment, Kethavar found himself escalating the demonstration. He gestured toward a pool of water, lifting it into the air and holding it in a perfect sphere 3 feet above the ground. Then he began to alter its temperature without changing its liquid state, creating pockets of hot and cold that should have caused immediate steam formation, but somehow did not. Elena and her fellow scientists watched with rapt attention, taking measurements and comparing readings. After several minutes, Elena spoke again. "You're creating localized alterations in thermodynamic properties," she said slowly, "but you're also preventing normal heat transfer between the different temperature zones. It's like you're creating isolated packets of space within the water sphere, each following different physical laws." She paused, thinking hard. That should require enormous amounts of energy to maintain. Where is that energy coming from? Kethavar did not answer. He could not answer because the human had identified something that even he did not fully understand. Psychic energy manipulation had always been intuitive for evolved species. You reached out with your mind. You grasped the fundamental forces, you shaped them to your will. The actual mechanisms involved were considered too complex for conscious thought. But Elena was thinking consciously about every aspect of what she observed, and her questions were revealing gaps in Kethvar's own understanding. "Show her the dimensional fold," suggested one of the other human scientists, a man with graying hair and intense eyes. "If she can analyze basic matter manipulation, let's see what she makes of space warping." Kethvar wanted to refuse but found himself curious despite his growing alarm. He reached out with his psychic abilities and grasped the fabric of space itself, folding it so that a point 10 feet away suddenly existed right next to Elena. He maintained the fold for several seconds, allowing her to examine the phenomenon, then released it. Elena stared at the space where the fold had been, then at her instruments, then back at the space. "You created a stable Einstein-Rosen bridge," she said in a voice filled with wonder. "A traversable wormhole. But the energy requirements should have torn this entire area apart. How did you stabilize the exotic matter necessary to keep the throat open?" "I do not use exotic matter," Kethvar said automatically. "Then what did you use?" Elena asked. "Something has to provide the negative energy density needed to prevent gravitational collapse. The mathematics are very clear on that point." Kethvar opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. He had never thought about the mathematics involved. Psychic abilities simply worked when properly applied. The idea that there might be underlying mathematical principles governing their use was not something he had ever considered. Elena seemed to interpret his silence as confirmation of something. She turned to her colleagues, speaking rapidly. "He's accessing zero-point energy fields. That's the only explanation that fits the data. He's somehow tapping into quantum vacuum fluctuations and using them to stabilize impossible configurations of matter and energy." She spun back to face Kethvar, excitement radiating from her small form. "But if that's true, then there should be efficiency losses in the energy transfer process. The quantum vacuum isn't perfectly uniform, so some frequencies should work better than others for different types of manipulation." Elena grabbed a tablet from one of her colleagues and began sketching rapidly. "Look, if you're accessing vacuum energy through quantum field fluctuations, then the optimal frequency for matter manipulation should be different from the optimal frequency for space-time warping. And both of those should show harmonic resonances that could be exploited to reduce energy costs." She thrust the tablet toward Kethvar, showing him a complex diagram covered with mathematical equations and wave function analyses. "Try using a modulated frequency pattern instead of constant energy output. These calculations suggest you could increase efficiency by at least 20%. Kethvar stared at the primitive human tablet displaying mathematics. That looked suspiciously like advanced psychic engineering theory. Without fully understanding why, he found himself applying Elena's suggested modifications to his psychic energy output. The steel sphere, which had been sitting ignored nearby, suddenly began to glow more brightly while using noticeably less of his mental effort to maintain the effect. "It worked," Elena breathed, taking new readings with her instruments. "The energy efficiency just jumped by exactly 23%. You're operating more effectively now than you were 5 minutes ago." Kethvar stood frozen, staring at the human woman who had just improved upon psychic techniques that had been perfected over millennia. Around them, the other humans were chattering excitedly, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. A silent one had just taught a psychic being how to use psychic abilities more effectively. It was impossible. It was unthinkable. It was happening right in front of him. And it was just the beginning. High Psychic Zenthara arrived on Earth within 6 hours of Kethvar's emergency transmission to Imperial Command. She had never left her meditation chambers for anything less than a full-scale rebellion or the discovery of a new galaxy to conquer. The idea that a single Silent One could require her personal attention was absurd enough to be intriguing. Zenthara was old even by Imperial standards. Her consciousness having transcended physical form centuries ago, she existed as pure psychic energy held together by will, and wrapped in a shimmering field that roughly approximated a humanoid shape. When she materialized on Earth's surface, the air itself seemed to bend around her presence. "Explain," she commanded, her mental voice cutting through Kethvar's thoughts like a blade. Kethavar tried to summarize the situation, but found himself stumbling over words that suddenly seemed inadequate. How could he explain that a silent one had improved his psychic efficiency? How could he describe the uncomfortable feeling that Elena Vasquez understood aspects of psychic manipulation that he himself had never considered? "Show me," Zenthara said finally, her patience wearing thin. Elena and her team of human scientists had been kept under guard since the demonstration, but they seemed more excited than frightened by the arrival of another alien being. When Zenthara manifested before them, Elena stepped forward with the same fearless curiosity she had shown Kethavar. "You're not using matter to maintain physical form," Elena observed, studying Zenthara with fascination. "You're pure conscious energy held in a stable configuration. That should be impossible according to thermodynamics, but obviously it's not. What's your binding mechanism?" Zenthara recoiled slightly. In her centuries of existence, no being had ever asked her to explain how she maintained her post-physical state. It was not a question that had answers because it was not a question that should ever be asked. "Silence," Zenthara commanded, exerting her full psychic presence. Lesser beings typically prostrated themselves when she applied even a fraction of her power. Elena swayed slightly but remained standing, her eyes still bright with curiosity. "Interesting," Elena said. "You're projecting some kind of neural inhibition field. It feels like someone trying to convince me that thinking is too difficult to bother with. But the effect has a definite frequency signature. I bet there's a way to build immunity to it with the right mental exercises." Zenthara felt something she had not experienced in centuries: shock. The human was analyzing her psychic domination technique while it was being applied to her. More than that, she was already beginning to develop resistance to it. "You will demonstrate your observations," Zenthara said, switching to a different approach. If the human wanted to understand, then understanding would be her doom. Zenthara would show her psychic abilities so advanced and complex that her primitive mind would shatter, trying to process them. The demonstration began with reality manipulation. Zenthara reached into the quantum foam that underlied all existence and began reshaping the fundamental constants of physics within a localized area. Gravity became stronger, then weaker, then began flowing sideways. Light bent into impossible spirals. Time itself began to flow at different rates in different locations. Elena and her team worked frantically to measure and record everything they could observe. They had brought every scientific instrument they could carry, and now deployed them all in a desperate attempt to gather data about phenomena that should have been beyond their comprehension. The gravitational alterations are following a quantum field manipulation pattern, Elena called out to her colleagues while reading from multiple instruments. "She's not changing the mass of objects. She's changing the coupling constant between matter and the gravitational field itself." Zenthara increased the complexity of her demonstration, folding space into configurations that created pocket dimensions within the normal flow of spacetime. She manifested energy from higher dimensional spaces and wove it into patterns that should have been incomprehensible to three-dimensional minds. But Elena continued her analysis, her excitement growing with each impossible phenomenon she witnessed. "She's accessing at least 11 dimensions," Elena said, rapidly scribbling calculations on her tablet. "Look at these energy readings. The power source has to be extra-dimensional, but she's somehow projecting it into our local spacetime through what looks like controlled dimensional membrane oscillations." Elena looked up from her instruments, eyes shining with discovery. "You're not just manipulating our reality. You're selectively importing physical laws from higher dimensional spaces where different rules apply. That's brilliant, but it's also incredibly inefficient." Zenthara stopped her demonstration so abruptly that several pocket dimensions collapsed simultaneously, creating brief flashes of light as space snapped back to its normal configuration. "Inefficient?" she said, her mental voice carrying dangerous overtones. "Well, yes," Elena said, apparently oblivious to the threat. "You're brute-forcing dimensional barriers instead of finding natural resonance points. It's like trying to break down a door instead of finding the key. The energy cost must be enormous." Elena turned her tablet towards Zenthara, displaying a complex multidimensional diagram. "See, if you map the dimensional membrane oscillations against quantum field fluctuation patterns, there are natural weak points where the barriers between dimensional spaces are already thin. You could slip through those gaps using a fraction of the energy you're currently expending. Without thinking, Zenthara found herself examining the human's crude diagram. The mathematics were primitive, rendered in notation systems she did not recognize, but the underlying concepts were sound. More than sound, they were insightful in ways that made her question her own techniques. "Your proposal would require precise timing," Zenthara said slowly. "Exactly." Elena's enthusiasm was infectious. "The resonance windows only stay open for microseconds, but they follow predictable patterns. You could synchronize your dimensional manipulations with natural quantum fluctuations instead of fighting against them." Elena began modifying her diagram, adding new variables and equations. "In fact, if you time it right, you could probably use the dimensional rebound effect to amplify your psychic energy output. Instead of losing power to dimensional resistance, you'd gain power from dimensional assistance." Zenthara stared at the diagram, her ancient mind reeling. The human was describing techniques that went beyond anything taught in imperial academies. She was proposing modifications to psychic abilities that could revolutionize how the empire itself operated. "Test it," Elena said simply. "Try the resonance timing approach on something simple." Zenthara found herself following the human's instructions, synchronizing her psychic energy output with the quantum fluctuation patterns Elena had identified. She attempted a basic matter manipulation, expecting little difference from her normal approach. The steel beam she was targeting did not just glow with psychic energy. It blazed with power while requiring less effort from her than any comparable manipulation in her centuries of existence. The energy efficiency improvement was not just noticeable, it was revolutionary. 47% increase in effective output, Elena reported, reading from her instruments. And that's just from one small optimization. Imagine what we could accomplish if we really understood the complete theoretical framework. Zenthara realized with growing horror that she was no longer conducting an assessment of a primitive species. She was receiving advanced education from beings she had classified as the lowest form of intelligent life in the galaxy. The implications were staggering. If Silent Ones could not only understand psychic principles but improve upon them, then everything the Empire believed about mental hierarchy was wrong. The cosmic order itself was built on a foundation that was crumbling beneath their feet, and the humans were just getting started. The cosmic architects had not convened in physical space for over 3,000 years. Their consciousness existed across multiple dimensions, their thoughts spanning galaxies, their decisions shaping the fate of entire civilizations. When they chose to manifest together in one location, reality itself bent to accommodate their presence. They came to Earth not as conquerors or judges, but as beings facing the first genuine threat to their existence in 50 millennia. The reports from Kethvar and Zenthara were impossible to believe, yet the evidence was undeniable. A species of Silent Ones had somehow demonstrated understanding of psychic principles that surpassed imperial knowledge. The lead architect, an entity so ancient its original name had been forgotten, manifested as a shifting pattern of light and thought that hurt to perceive directly. Around it gathered 5 others, each representing different aspects of imperial power. War, knowledge, control, expansion, and order. Elena Vasquez and her expanded team of human scientists waited in the cleared area that had become an impromptu laboratory. Word of the demonstrations had spread through Earth's scientific community, and now representatives from every major research institution stood ready to observe whatever the aliens would show them. Elena felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Everything humanity had learned about the universe was about to be tested against powers that treated physical laws like suggestions. But instead of fear, she felt the familiar excitement that came with the possibility of understanding something completely new. "We are the cosmic architects," the lead entity communicated, its thoughts pressing against every human mind simultaneously. "We have shaped galactic civilization for 50,000 years. We have classified over 10,000 species. We have never been wrong." The entity's attention focused on Elena like the weight of a star. "You claim to understand that which is beyond your nature. You claim to improve that which is already perfect. Prove these claims or watch your species burn." Elena stepped forward, her small human form dwarfed by beings that existed partially outside normal space-time. "We don't claim to be better than you," she said clearly. "We claim to be different. You have power. We have curiosity. You've spent 50,000 years using your abilities. We want to spend 5 minutes understanding them." The demonstration that followed was beyond anything Elena had witnessed before. The architects reached into the fundamental structure of reality itself, showing her how they could rewrite physical constants, create new forms of matter, open doorways between galaxies, and manipulate time as easily as reshaping clay. They showed her the technology that maintained their empire. World-sized computers built from crystallized thought, faster-than-light communication networks that used quantum entanglement across galactic distances, and weapons that could unmake entire star systems by convincing them they had never existed. With each impossible feat, Elena and her team worked furiously to understand and analyze. They measured energy outputs that registered beyond their instruments' ability to process. They recorded dimensional manipulations that seemed to violate every known law of physics. They documented techniques that appeared to be pure magic but had to follow some kind of systematic rules. Impossible, declared the architect of knowledge. After Elena correctly predicted the energy resonance pattern of a technique she had never seen before, silent ones cannot comprehend dimensional mathematics. You're right. We can't comprehend them completely, Elena agreed. Pulling up a holographic display her team had jury-rigged from salvaged alien technology. But we can model them. Look, the display showed a complex, three-dimensional map of what Elena's team had dubbed psychic space and the mathematical framework that seemed to underlie all the abilities they had observed. It was incomplete, full of gaps and approximations, but it accurately predicted the behavior of every psychic technique they had measured. Your dimensional manipulations follow conservation principles, Elena explained, pointing to specific areas of the model. Energy and matter can't be created or destroyed, only moved between dimensional states. But you're doing it inefficiently because you're treating each dimensional layer as separate when they're actually interconnected. She highlighted a series of connection points in the model. See these resonance nodes? They're natural bridges between dimensional states. If you route your energy through them instead of forcing direct transitions, you can achieve the same results with dramatically less power expenditure. The architect of knowledge examined Elena's model with growing alarm. The primitive mathematical framework somehow captured principles that had taken the Empire millennia to discover through trial and error. More disturbing, it suggested improvements that no imperial scholar had ever considered. Test the resonance routing approach, Elena suggested. Pick any technique you want. Run it through the resonance nodes instead of forcing direct dimensional transitions. The architect of war decided to call the humans' bluff. It reached out with powers that could crack planets and attempted to open a portal between Earth and a star system 50,000 light-years away. Normally, such a feat required the combined efforts of multiple architects working in concert. Following Elena's model, the architect routed its energy through the resonance nodes Elena had identified. The portal opened instantly, requiring less than half the expected power expenditure. Through it, the startled inhabitants of a distant world could clearly see Earth's blue sky and white clouds. The architect of war closed the portal quickly, but not before every human in the area had seen proof that their mathematical model worked better than techniques perfected over galactic ages. How? Demanded the architect of control, its mental voice carrying overtones of disbelief. Elena smiled, and there was something in that expression that made ancient cosmic entities suddenly feel very young. Because you learned your abilities through intuition and tradition. You know what works, but you never asked why it works. We're asking why. She gestured to her team of scientists, who were already working on refinements to their psychic space model based on the new data from the portal demonstration. You've had these powers for 50,000 years, but you've been using them like we used fire for most of human history. We lit fires and cooked food and stayed warm, but we didn't understand combustion chemistry. Once we understood the actual mechanisms involved, we built engines and rockets and power plants. Elena's voice grew stronger as she continued. You're not just showing us how to manipulate reality. You're showing us the physics that make reality manipulation possible. And once we understand the physics, we can engineer better solutions. The cosmic architects fell silent, their vast intelligences grappling with implications that threatened the foundation of everything they had built. If the humans were right, then psychic abilities were not manifestations of evolutionary superiority, but applications of discoverable scientific principles. Principles that could be learned, improved upon, and taught to anyone willing to study them. What do you want? Asked the lead architect finally, though it suspected it already knew the answer. Elena's smile widened. The same thing I wanted from the beginning. Show us how it all works. Not just the techniques you've shown us today, but everything. Your faster-than-light communication, your matter converters, your dimensional storage systems, your galactic navigation networks. All of it. She paused, letting the words sink in. We don't want to join your empire as silent ones or even as psychic beings. We want to understand your empire so completely that we can rebuild it better. The cosmic architects realized they were facing something unprecedented in galactic history. The humans were not seeking to overthrow the empire through force or rebellion. They were seeking to make it obsolete through comprehension. One demand had indeed ended the empire's cosmic plans. Not through destruction, but through the simple, terrifying possibility that someone might finally understand how everything worked, and in that understanding, build something better. The age of psychic dominance was ending. The age of engineered transcendence was about to begin, and it would be led by a species the Empire had classified as too primitive to matter.